She defines status as widely shared cultural beliefs, and that will be pretty much the definition we'll use, although we'll be more precise on it. They are often attached to classes or types of people. And by types of people, we mean almost any sort of category, any social category can have status beliefs attached to it. Anytime you have any status beliefs attached to a group, what you're doing is you're ranking them in terms of what people think about the esteem that they are entitled to, the respect they're entitled to, and how much competence they have. And that's a pretty good informal definition of what status is. Towards the end of today's meeting, we'll have a formal definition of it, but the idea there is these are just beliefs that are attached to groups of people, to classes, to categories, about esteem and competence, how well they can do things. They operate in a wide range of social contexts. They're specific to a situation. They're usually specific to particular actors. That is, when status affects things, it affects it through interaction processes of specific people. So when you say there's a status difference in our society associated with gender, there's advantages to being male and disadvantages to being female, those are enacted when you have women and men working together. I mean, when they're just beliefs, they don't really have anything to do with anything. But they get enacted when people are interacting, when people are together. They're social definitions. They may be independent of evidence. So what we're concerned with here is cultural beliefs, which may or may not be supported by evidence. We don't really care whether they're true. What we care about is that people believe them. And they're resilient, they're persistent, and therefore they help perpetuate social structures. Because of the beliefs, they help perpetuate inequalities in society. Why do the beliefs matter? Well, she points out that inequality that's based on resources, like money or power, tends to be unstable. If you have an inequality structure that's based on power, by and large, at some point, people who are subject to the power are going to rebel and take power away from the guys who have it. Same thing is true with money, resources. I mean, you can have revolutions that will redistribute money. You can have laws that will redistribute it. So inequality in a society that's based on those two things alone is likely to be unstable at some point. Inequality that's based on status beliefs is going to be stable as long as those beliefs persist. So as long as people have the beliefs about differential esteem and competence associated with groups of people, then the inequality that's based on those beliefs is likely to persist. Once a status inequality exists, it tends to generate material inequalities. That is, it generates inequalities of power and money, wealth. So it's actually a very important mechanism in creating and recreating inequalities in society. It's a training mechanism. Training mechanism is the self-other expectations that get attached to people and the behaviors that are governed by those expectations. And you know what those expectations are and what those behaviors are, right? Am I talking too fast? I'm just worried about the time.
You said that if it's based on power.
Inequality based on power is unstable. Yeah. You think about in a society where the rulers are ruling by power, at some point there's likely to be a revolt, or at least people trying to get out from under it. But if the inequality is based on beliefs, like status beliefs, unless those beliefs change, the inequality is going to persist. And the beliefs tend to perpetuate themselves. So, if you focus on how status inequalities get created and how they're maintained, that'll separate differences from resources and power, emphasize that status is an independent causal force, and it'll show the links between beliefs and material inequality. That was what she wanted to conclude in the paper. The beliefs are powerful, they're independent, and they perpetuate structural inequality. Notice that this is the first time we have considered the inequalities in society. And we can do that now because we're talking about status differences. Up until now, we've been talking about interpersonal inequalities in the groups, for instance. But the status beliefs exist in a society, and they tend to produce the same sorts of inequality that we saw in small groups. Status beliefs, as I said, include ideas about competence, how well people in that group can do things, agency, that is, how likely they are to take charge and have control over their own lives, and worthiness, social worthiness. That's what status beliefs really are. How worthwhile are people of that category? And the interesting thing about it is the person does not need personally to endorse the status beliefs. They're going to have an effect as long as somebody believes that most people share those beliefs. So I don't have to have a status belief about members of a particular group for it to affect my interaction with them. Rather, as long as I know that most people have those beliefs, then I expect this is how the people I interact with are going to interact, and I adjust to that. What do status beliefs do? Well, they shape judgments and behavior just like expectations do. They govern preferences for association. I would like to associate with people of this sort, not with people of that sort. They affect the responses to challenges. If somebody has a status disadvantage and doesn't act like it, that's called a status challenge, and people respond to that. All of these are boundary maintaining operations. Okay? Oh, okay, back up. If you think about status beliefs affecting judgments, which will then affect behavior, the way they work is if the status belief becomes salient, it biases the expectations that are attached to the individual. And those expectations have more and more effect as they become more and more related to the goals of the group. So one of the widely held beliefs among the widely held beliefs associated with gender in our group in our culture is that women are not very good at mathematics. Well, so you would expect then gender is going to have a big effect on engineering because it's a very math-intensive field. If you want to see the effects of status beliefs associated with gender, you might very well see a big effect in engineering. You might see a smaller effect in areas where they're not, the beliefs are not closely related to the group. Self-fulfilling effects on behavior. Just like with expectations, we don't usually recognize what's going on. We simply interact. And the differences tend to legitimate the inequality just because that's the way we act. That makes sense? Does that sound like the paper you read? I hope it does. challenges, you almost always get hostility when there's challenges. Challenges mean somebody who's got a status disadvantage doesn't act like he or she has a disadvantage. And if that happens, what you're going to see is, very likely to see, is that other people will do something to suppress the inappropriate behavior. If women act assertively, for instance, status beliefs are women should not be assertive. You find an assertive woman, you'll find people acting to try to control her. Show her it's inappropriate, not let her be assertive, use unpleasant names for her, things like that. And the reason is these challenges are a threat to the status hierarchy. People believe in the status hierarchy because they share these status beliefs. And if somebody acts like he or she doesn't share them, that's a threat to the hierarchy. And by and large, people will take steps to try to suppress that threat. Somebody's getting above himself, social movement is too extreme. Lots of processes that tend to maintain the status inequalities. Presumably, here, if you know how it works, you know how you could intervene to affect it, just like with expectations.
Can you go back to the slide just previously?
Sure.
Briefly.
Surely. Would you like this, or would you like to photograph it?
I want to photograph it.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure?
Two photos.
Am I in the picture?
Not this time.
Okay.
Your hand is getting a lot of action.
My hand is good. The hands are in the picture.
So it's all happening very much under a veil of just kind of unconsciously.
Yeah, I think it's unconscious, and I think it's not spoken of. And it'll work, as I said a couple of slides ago, it'll work even if a person does not endorse the beliefs. As long as you know that most people endorse those beliefs, it affects the way you try to interact with most people.
To me, it reminds me of groupthink.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Yeah. The most common place in society where you have cross-category interactions is by gender. That is, everybody, most of us, spend most of our lives in mixed gender groups. And the contrast then is very likely to make gender a salient status characteristic. That's one of the things that people notice. If people are describing somebody, they almost always include gender. When people come into a mixed gender group, they almost always notice it. They may not talk about it, they may not make a point of it, but they notice it. Same thing if they come into a same-sex group, they notice that too. But whatever it is, it's a salient characteristic. And of the status characteristics in society, it's the one where you most often have cross-group interaction. And as long as there's a contrast, that as long as you notice that there are both women and men there, that's going to make it salient. People are going to notice it. We'll get back into that in a little bit more detail later. But the point is, when you have any kind of contrast in status, it becomes salient. Yeah?
So you're saying that people won't notice if it's a same-sex group?
Probably don't pay attention to that. Probably, or to say it slightly differently, more precisely, unlikely to affect the way they interact. In a mixed gender group, it does affect the way we interact. In a same gender...
How they interact?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So we just notice it right away.
Yeah. Yeah. And if somebody said, what was the group like, that's probably something you would tell me. You'd probably tell me either way. You'd probably say it was all women, or you'd say it was both women and men. So it's such a common kind of cross-status interaction that I think most of us every day engage in that kind of mixture.
As opposed to race and class?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine people who spend their days in same-sex groups. Nuns, maybe. But even those occasionally will interact. But the important thing is the contrast triggers the salience. It makes it important. In organizations, there's all kinds of legal and informal norms saying we really shouldn't pay attention to gender in terms of pay, in terms of promotion, in terms of the way we treat people. But you still find that there's processes that are maintaining the gender inequality in pay, in job definitions, in authority structures. Policies? Yeah. But most of the policies are saying you should have gender equality. And
But as they work out, sometimes you can find where they're not. They might say that on one hand, but then write a policy that's not necessarily.
absolutely. And one of the things Ridgway observed in her article is when you have a new situation, you're going to see a stronger effect of gender than in established ones. Because in established corporations, for instance, they're likely to have gender equality laws and practices. In a new one, they're much less likely to have those. So, for instance, tech companies, it's a new kind of corporation, and you find really strong gender inequalities in tech companies, a lot more than you find in older corporations, because they're new. The gender is having an effect, but they don't yet have all of the equating rules and practices. Same thing in domestic partnerships. The inequality in a domestic partnership is larger than the inequality in marriages, because in marriages we have all kinds of cultural norms now that say these people should be equal. Well, domestic partnerships, people who are forming what looks like a family except they're not married, don't yet have those established. So the gender inequality there is usually greater. Any kind of new situation is unlikely to have established all of the practices and norms that are promoting equality. And therefore, in a new situation, the gender inequality is likely to be most noticeable. One of the things it does for the parents of teenagers has to do with drinking. We know that the most important factor in whether a teenager is a drinker or an abstainer is the peer group, and especially what they call their best friends, which you as a sociologist would call their reference group. Those are the most influential. All of my best friends drink, well, I want to drink too. All of my best friends abstain, I want to abstain too. In a mixed gender group of best friends, one of the interesting things they find is the boys influence the girls. That is, if the boys drink, the girls drink. If the boys don't drink, the girls don't drink. The girls don't influence the boys. And so if you control all of the other effects, the effects of what the family wants, the school wants, the religiosity, all of those, you're still getting a gender effect on who's...
I don't think he's buying it.
Yeah, I don't agree with that.
You don't agree with that?
Also influence the boys.
Yeah, but you can't say you don't agree if there's evidence. I mean, you look at the evidence.
Evidence I had in my life.
It's not your life, okay.
46 years of living there. Yeah. You want some loving there. You need to do it first.
Even in terms of drinking? Among adults, same sort of thing. Use of recreational drugs. Men influence women much more than women influence men. Risky sexual behaviors. Men influence women more than women influence men. So you're seeing strong gender effects on influence in lots of different settings. I like those cases because they really have almost nothing to do with gender. They're just things that people do. But not in your life. Class status processes.
Go back 1 second.
Sure. You read the article, that was what it said. And you assign somebody to take notes on it. I used to teach very large sections of introductory sociology. It was a room that held 225 people. And I would lecture, and most of the students would be taking notes. And every once in a while, I'd notice a student who was just sitting there like this, not taking notes. And it was always a male. And I would say, "You're not taking notes." And he would say, "What?"
Trying to listen. I don't know.
He was recorded.
"My girlfriend's taking them for me."
Oh my God.
Now, I never heard a female student say, "My boyfriend's taking notes for me."
Like, probably doesn't know how to cook eggs either.
Possibly.
Yeah, he's like, my mom's cooking for me, it's cool.
Class processes usually get activated when you have cross interaction. For instance, you have middle class teachers who are sometimes dealing with working class parents. That gives that biases the sorts of interaction that take place among the teachers and the parents. Same thing happens if you have middle class teachers interacting with upper class rich parents. Biases the interaction among them because it's a class status difference. Shows up in doctors' offices, shows up in employment situations, particularly in interview situations. One of the things that you get by being in a favored socioeconomic position is you understand the rules better. You know how important it is to do things in a certain way. Educational institutions, job interviews, those are places where social class is very often associated with knowledge of how this organization functions, which will, of course, bias the sorts of interaction you get. Different behaviors get attributed to differential skill. That is, people notice these differences, and they may even talk about them, but they usually don't say, "This is because we have a class difference here." They say, "He knows more about it than she does," or something like that. Compared to, excuse me, compared to gender, cross-race interaction is less common. It's certainly not unheard of, but it's much less common because of residential segregation, occupational segregation, all kinds of other reasons. And as long as there's no interaction, it's possible to maintain status beliefs. That is, I can have beliefs about another group of people. If I never interact with them, I'm not going to have those beliefs challenged by any of their experience. So race, gender beliefs tend to be very resistant to change. Recently, you can see some things that are making a difference. Ethnicity, the numbers of people moving into a country, especially from migration. The fact that we had an African-American president, very visible. Increasing income and political equality. So there's changes that tend to challenge the status beliefs, but the status beliefs are still there. And, sorry, and I think they probably are easier to maintain because there is less cross-race interaction than there is, for instance, cross-gender interaction.
So you're only comparing it to gender?
Yeah. Well, you can do it to social class too. Sorry. It's pretty hard for you to interact all day with only people in your own social class. You're going to encounter richer ones or poorer ones at some point.
Well, that's hard for, I would say, white people,
Yeah. Yeah.
but if you compare it to gender, yeah, it's going to be less.
Yeah. Responses to status challenges: isolation, reasserting position, same as you get in other cases. But, sorry, the big three of statuses in our society and in most societies are race and gender and economic. And all of them have very similar consequences. Most of the things you say about cross-race interaction, you could also say about cross-gender interaction or cross-class interaction. Okay? You're a teacher, aren't you? No.
Me?
No, I thought she was. You're not? No. You told me once you had to go to school. Maybe that was for your own child.
That was for my child.
Ah, gotcha. Okay. So overall, status beliefs are important. They show up whenever there's mixed status interaction. They create and they maintain inequality. They all have to do with esteem, respect, and competence. Not actual competence, but imputed or inferred or guessed competence. Status beliefs are based on culture, not on material. It works at the individual level. Every time there's interactions, if there's status inequality, it affects the interactions, and the interactions affect what people believe about each other. And status governs group differences in resources and power. That is, having a status advantage will help you get more money and have more power.
So can you speak a little more about that fourth bullet, status works primarily at individual, not structural level?
Yeah.
How it does not work at a structural level?
Structural level is often influenced by laws. So there are laws about hiring women and men or different ethnic groups. And so the inequality that's produced by the status takes place when people interact rather than in terms of classes of people, groups of people. I think what Ridgway was concerned about is that people have overlooked the significance of all of those little interactions and how they affect, how they're governed by beliefs and how they tend to reproduce the beliefs and to maintain the inequalities in the society.
Do you feel like that flows up to a structural level? Because we definitely have evidence of that.
Oh yeah, oh yeah.
So, but her point is that it starts small, at micro level.
Yeah, and status beliefs, remember, have to do with esteem and competence. And whatever my status beliefs may be about, let's say, rich people, that doesn't affect them. But if I interact with them, that does affect them. So the status beliefs really affect how people interact. They don't affect the structure of the society except as those interactions multiply.
Right. Okay, gotcha.
You like wine? Do you know there's status differences in wine? Our colleague, Wei Zhou, has studied wine status differences. Status differences among wine, people will say this is a good wine or this is a bad wine, right?
Which is always a little.
Nobody drinks?
Suspect. Oh, yes.
Nobody drinks? Do you have friends who say things like, I can always tell a good Scotch? Research shows you can't. Most people can't on the first drink, and after they've had the first drink, their sense of taste is dulled enough they really can't. When I was in college at one point, I was social chair of a living group, and I started buying the cheapest vodka and bourbon and scotch that they had. And I put it into expensive bottles. And so when we had parties, people would say things, boy, I can sure tell a good bourbon. I love this one. No, you really can't. You can save a lot of money by buying the cheap stuff. Wine, there surely is taste differences, but we're interested here in whether people think they're good or not. Many, many years ago, the Italian-Swiss colony had the price leader of wines. It was 89 cents for a fifth. This is when I was in college. I remember it well. About half the price of milk. Therefore, obviously, what you should put on your cereal. And at that point, Gallo was just getting started, and they built large wineries down by Modesto. And they had a competitor for Italian-Swiss. They were selling for the same price, and Italian-Swiss was outselling them by multiple numbers. They went to market researchers. The market researchers held focus groups, and they said, here's what you should do. Double the price of the Gallo wine. They did, and sales just took off. Must be better if it costs more. So, on wine prices, there's various status factors. Joe studied the effect of tasting scores. There are tasting scores that show up in Wine Spectator magazine and other places. The appellation, that is whether it has qualified for whatever you have to do to qualify for that. The label, whether the appellation is listed on the label or not. If you list it on the label, it's going to have more effect. The winery's organizational status. Do people think it's a good winery, an impressive winery? And what he tried to do is to see how those factors affected the price of the wine. So he predicted that these status factors will affect the price of the wine. And he found indeed they did. The dependent variable was price. Predicted if you have more statuses, like putting the appellation on the label, it's going to have a bigger effect on price. If they're all positive, that's going to help price more than if a couple of them are negative. And the winery's organizational status turned out to be more important than the tasting scores. That's kind of interesting. People say, oh, this comes from a good winery. I don't really care what the professional tasters said. But in all those cases, what you're seeing is the effect of various status markers. And all of them combine to affect the price of the wine. Notice I didn't say anything about whether it tasted good, because that was irrelevant. So what he saw was that the status variables had effect on price, and most alcohol is particularly sensitive to status. If you watched ads, especially around Christmas time, you watch ads for various kinds of liquor, and you'll see that they're appealing to the status, the prestige of it. Give this to your friends and they'll be impressed. Or serve this at your Christmas party and they'll be impressed. They almost never say, oh, it tastes wonderful, or it gets you drunk faster, or anything like that. Make sense? What you see then in the Joe study and in the Getting Your Friends to Drink study is that status factors are affecting various outcomes. Getting your friends to drink is influence. The wine, it's affecting the price, which really means how much people want it, because the more they want it, the more they're willing to pay for it. So now all we need to do is to figure out if we can find a way to predict those outcomes. What we need to do is to extend our theory so that we can understand how status interacts with expectations. You remember the Bales groups, and I think I mentioned sort of in passing at the time, they were very homogeneous. They were all Harvard undergraduates. They were the same age. Harvard undergraduates were all male, all white, all upper socioeconomic status, all fairly smart. There was almost nothing that distinguished them. That was why it was so striking when the Bales groups always developed an inequality structure, because these people were just so much alike to begin with. Franz and Larson and He and Wang studied heterogeneous groups, and they found very similar findings, except that now you have to say, well, how come this works when they're heterogeneous, when they're not all the same to begin with, and how can we predict that? And of course, homogeneous groups are kind of unusual. Heterogeneous groups are much more common. Most of what you see in any kind of committee that's put together, or a task group in a corporation, or a platoon in a military, they're going to be mixed race, mixed gender, mixed socioeconomic status, mixed age, mixed educational level, all kinds of characteristics that we think of as being status characteristics in our culture. That's just the common one. And the simplest relationship is to say the socially advantaged characteristics will lead to a power and prestige advantage in a task group. That seems to be what we found. There's all kinds of measures of power and prestige, like influence, getting your friends to drink, or price. But whatever the situation is, if there's a socially advantageous group, it is likely to then have an advantage in power and prestige in task groups. Make sense? Sound familiar? Franz and Larson put an expert into the group. Other Bales type groups, when you have age inequality or gender inequality, you get inequality in the power and prestige structure. And there's two differences between heterogeneous and homogeneous groups. In the homogeneous groups that Bales studied, remember he said at the outset of interaction, there was what he called a status struggle. Everybody's trying to speak at once, everybody's trying to exert influence, everybody's trying to take control of the group. After a few minutes, 5 to 10 minutes, that settles down and you get this power and prestige structure. But there was this undifferentiated phase where there's a struggle going on in the Bales groups. You don't see that if there's gender or age or educational level inequality to begin with. If there's any kind of status inequality to begin with, they don't have that undifferentiated phase and they don't have the status struggle going on. Franz and Larson never saw a status struggle, or at least didn't report it. And second, the inequality is there from the very outset of interaction. Remember we said that in the Bales groups it took 10 or so minutes for the inequality in power and prestige to become evident. If it's a group where they are differentiated by age or gender or educational level or any of the other statuses, the inequality is evident as soon as they start interacting. And it parallels the status inequality.
So, to me, that's the same thing. So there's no status struggle in the beginning.
I'm sorry?
There's no, okay, so the two differences is there's no status struggle in the beginning
Right.
because of the inequality.
Because there is inequality, and there's also inequality at the very beginning.
So one begets the other.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's going on? Well, one way we could explain it is to say they're differentiated expectations. They've got a power and prestige structure from the very beginning, and the power and prestige structure is predictable from the status structure. So if we knew that status inequality produces expectation inequality, that would explain it. And in order to do that thoroughly, we need to explain it, explain conditions under which it occurs, and precisely define what we're talking about. In broad terms, it looks like this. Remember what we had 2 weeks ago. Interaction processes, including unit evaluations, influence, and participation, create performance expectations. Performance expectations create power and prestige structure. Remember all that? All we have now is just one additional way that you get performance expectations, and that is status characteristics can produce performance expectations. And if they produce performance expectations, then you get the power and prestige structure. So what we, huh?
I was just thinking about that, because when we were first starting just to talk about Bell's groups, it was almost like we were doing everything in a vacuum a little bit, not real world kind of scenario, because we came
Sure.
with no expectations, like everybody was free.
Yeah. But that's one of the reasons I gave you the Ridgway paper, because she's not at all concerned with that.
Now you're just throwing in
Yeah.
real world stuff here.
Yeah. Yeah. But see, many of the consequences are about the same as we've already seen. Because performance expectation states, remember, are going to govern interaction in task groups. But you think about the groups that we get involved in, almost all of them are task groups. In classes, committees, juries, teams that work together. So status characteristics are likely to have an effect in most of the groups that we exist in, that we work in. So to explain it, same scope conditions that we had before, except that these are not going to be people who start out equal. They're going to be people who start out with a status difference. Going to make two new definitions. One is a diffuse status characteristic and one is a specific status characteristic. Those are two new terms. And then 5 general propositions to explain what we've seen up till now. So the structure of what I want to do is to show how what we knew about expectation states can be generalized to situations where people start out with status characteristics evident. Because we want to be able to account for task groups where people are different in terms of age, educational level, almost anything. Almost anything that our society gives status value to.
You said diffuse and...
Specific, I'm coming back.
Oh.
Sometimes this works. There it is, good. So here's what I wanted to show, what I was talking about before. Scope conditions, at least 2 people, call them person and other. A task, outcome states, success, failure. And a specific expectation whose states are relevant to task outcomes. You have this ability, you're going to succeed. You don't have this ability, you're going to fail. People are task focused, collectively oriented. So the scope conditions are the same as we had before, just talking about a few new things. I want to introduce a couple of other terms, and you will not need to remember them in great detail, but you need to know what they are. Task-specific ability expectation, that is expectations that are relevant to this task that this group is working on now. General expectations are expectations having to do with things that don't have any limit, or at least we don't know what the limits are. He's just good at everything, or she's very good at everything. Specific status characteristics, 2 or more states that the culture evaluates differently, and each state carries a similarly evaluated specific performance expectation. Those things. So for instance, you can talk about being a Sudoku champion. That's a specific status characteristic. If you know that somebody is a Sudoku champion, that gives you ideas about how well he or she can play Sudoku. Doesn't tell you anything about other stuff, but it tells you that. If you know somebody has won a spelling bee, or if you know somebody scores very highly on the verbal SAT scores, all of those things are specific status characteristics. Why are they specific characteristics? Well, there's 2 or more states. You can be a champion or not. And they're differentially evaluated. People think it's better to be a champion than not to be. And they have similarly evaluated specific performance expectations. You can do certain things better. Then there's diffuse status characteristics. The first 2 parts are the same, 2 or more states, specific expectations. But for a diffuse characteristic, they have similarly evaluated general performance expectations. People who have the high state of a D can do many things better. I don't know what the limits are. So suppose you live in a culture where people believe that men are more rational, more mathematical, more logical, better able to change a tire, can do most things better than women. If that's the culture you live in, that means gender is a diffuse status characteristic. I don't know what the limit is, but most things men can do better. Got the idea of specific and general diffuse status characteristics? Those 2 I think are important, so I hope you'll remember those.
One other thing I heard is a description of diffuse and specific is that diffuse is really something you can't alter.
Oh no, you can alter it. Oh sure.
Okay.
If I'm a spelling bee champion, I mean I could forget how to spell, or if you're not one, you could become one. Yeah, those are changeable. Many of the diffuse ones that we are concerned with are hard to change, but not impossible. I'm sorry, not all of them. Not all of them. Now for our explanation, it'd be bigger, there we go. We have 5 assumptions. And I want you to know what these say. I don't expect you to have all the wording exactly the same. But they describe a process that's actually fairly orderly. First, if there's any status element in the situation, if it differentiates people, it's going to become salient. Salient means it's an important social fact. It's going to have effects. So if it differentiates people, it's likely to become salient. Or if people think it's relevant to task completion, it's likely to become salient. For instance, you have a group of women and men together, that is likely to become salient because it's a status difference that distinguishes people. If you have a group of all women, and it is known that some of them are very good at changing diapers and some of them are not, that's a specific status characteristic, and it's likely to become salient because they differ. Gender isn't likely to become salient, but diaper changing skill is. So, if there's status in the situation, if it differentiates people, it's going to become salient. If they believe it's related to their task, it's likely to become salient. Second, if it becomes salient, then people are going to form performance expectations unless they know for sure that it's irrelevant. How do you know for sure it's irrelevant? Most of the time you don't. So you say, well, my best guess is this is going to tell me how well he or she can do something. So the first assumption says, if there's status differentiation in the group, it'll become salient, or if they think it's relevant, if they think the status characteristic is relevant to the task, it'll become salient. Second, if it becomes salient, it'll create performance expectations. People who have the advantage on a salient characteristic are people who are assigned high performance expectations. People who have a disadvantage on a salient characteristic are assigned low performance expectations. Third assumption, this process works as long as there's groups of people, as long as the people are getting to know each other. If a new person comes into the group, if a new person comes into the group, the same process will assign expectations to the new person. If somebody leaves the group, the paths that were formed by that person remain even though the person's gone. Sure. If somebody enters the group, the process will assign expectations to that person. You bring a newcomer into the group. Same thing works for that person. If somebody who was there leaves, the connections that have been established will stay even though the person goes. So for instance, there have been studies in which they would have mixed gender task groups. If you have a mixed gender task group, you know there's a status advantage associated with being male, disadvantage being female. The men tend to dominate those groups. They intervened in some of them, and they showed the participants that a woman was particularly skillful at this. So they formed high expectations for her. Then she left. Then they took the men and had them interact with a new woman, a second woman. They formed higher expectations for the second woman than people who had not had that experience. So it holds on even if somebody leaves. That's what that means, which is very useful for designing interventions. Fourth assumption, all salient status information gets used, nothing gets ignored. And finally, behavior. That's supposed to be back here. Once aggregate expectations form for every actor, then the power and prestige structure of the group is predictable from the relative expectations they hold. So assumption 1 says if there's a status difference, if people think the status is related to the task outcome, it becomes salient. Once it becomes salient, people will form performance expectations that are the same as the position on status characteristic. Third one says it works for if you bring new people in, and if somebody leaves, that still their effect is still there. And 5 says once expectations have been assigned to everybody, those will predict the person's position on the power and prestige structure. They'll get to talk more, they'll get to be more influential. So you imagine a group of adolescents getting together. Their task is to decide whether they're going to drink, not counting your friends. And they notice there's a gender difference, and they notice that that's a status evaluation thing. So it may be that the boys know more about whether it's good to drink than the girls do. Okay? As I say, I don't expect you to remember all of the precision there, but I do hope you will remember what each of those assumptions claims. Those will allow us then to explain all of the findings in status differentiated groups. So what do you know? Actors treat status characteristics as useful information when they're forming expectations, unless they know for sure that a particular characteristic is irrelevant. And they almost never know that. I mean, how do you know for sure it's irrelevant? They use all the available information. They don't ignore anything. Nothing is a master status, which is so important that once you know that, the others don't matter. Expectations persist when actors enter or leave. And expectations govern the distribution of all the elements of a group's power and prestige structure. Action opportunities, performance outputs, evaluations, influence, beliefs about social worth and ability, choices for leadership, all those things we saw. So what I hope you feel you've got is an explanation for how status affects interaction in task groups. What it does is it creates performance expectations, and the performance expectations then do what we've seen before. Question?